Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vine, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer, and He enables me to walk on the heights. Does God really care about the smallest details of your and my life? Sometimes it's easy when we're in the middle of struggles to say, God, where are you? When the fig tree isn't blossoming, and when everything is going wrong in our lives, and when we face tragedy, when we face loss, when we face things like just the news like we've heard over this last week of another school shooting, and we wonder, God, where are you in the midst of this? Is God there? I'm going to share briefly a story tonight before I draw. And I'm a writer. I've written a couple of novels. And if I were to write this story down and submit it as a novel, no editor would accept it because they would say, no, that's just too crazy. It can't happen. But because it happened to me, I can say, yes, it did. And I can say, God cares about every one of us. And I don't care what you're facing in your life. He cares about the smallest detail. Now, this is a long story, and I'm not going to tell it in full because we'd be here till about 9 o'clock, and you'd probably get bored. But maybe not. But anyway, I have been drawing, I said, going on 40 years. It'll be this June will be my 40th anniversary in chalk art. And I've drawn in some of the craziest places in the world. In fact, when I first started drawing, I told God, if you keep me in chalk and paper, I'll draw wherever you open a door. And He has opened some doors into some really weird places over the years. My favorite of all time is the Take Off Pounds Sensibly annual weight loss celebration, wait for it, banquet. Now, I don't know how much weight they lost. It must have been a lot because they had a huge banquet. It was one of the best I've ever done. But God has opened some strange doors over the years. But one of the ones that I didn't want to go through was when I got an invitation to go to Huntsville, Texas and draw in the Wynn unit, a prison. I am squeaky clean. Never had a parking ticket. Now, I have gotten a speeding ticket since then, so I can't say I'm quite so squeaky clean. But I knew nothing about the criminal justice system. And yes, I was scared to death. And yes, I didn't really want to follow through on that commitment I'd made to God to go wherever He opened the door, but I had made the promise. So I said, okay, God, I'll go. So I set it up. And, God has a sense of humor. Because when I started thinking about it, I said, well, there'll be a chaplain there. And the chaplain will kind of hold my hand and he'll walk with me and he'll jump in front of me if somebody tries to kill me. So I was all ready, But God also has a way of knocking your props out from under you. 2 weeks before I was supposed to go in, I got a call from the chaplain. Jim, you'll never believe it. I've got to have gallbladder surgery. And guess what day they scheduled the surgery for? Yeah, it was the day I was coming in. And he said, don't worry about it. Just come on down and the guys will come out and you'll have a good time. And that's what I was afraid of. But I had made that promise. So I packed up my easel and went, as Paul did with great fear and trembling, to Huntsville, Texas. And this is, the Wynn unit is one of the old prisons in Texas. It's actually got a church building in it. And I went and set up, and about 150 guys came out, all dressed in white. And when they began to sing, it was like nothing I'd ever heard before. I'd been pastoring for years and years, and I was kind of used to, churches where they sang like, "What a friend we have in Jesus." Not a lot of enthusiasm. And when these guys started to sing, it was like the roof was going to come off the place. And I couldn't understand, how could you have such joy in such a dark place? Well, they got to a part where a lot of churches do, where they said, let's stand up and greet one another, And by that time, I wasn't afraid that anybody was going to kill me anymore. So I decided to go off the platform and shake hands. I went over to this section here, and when I walked over here, about 50 guys reached out their hands and wanted to shake my hand. And I didn't understand that. I wasn't famous. I wasn't Johnny Cash coming in to do a program for him. I was just some guy that came in. But they were so hungry for someone to care about them that they just wanted to shake my hand. Well, as I left the prison that day, I told God, I said, Lord, I don't know what your plan is, but I'd love to do more of this. And he graciously began to open more doors into prisons, so much so, I was pastoring at the time, I got to where I really felt that God was leading me out of pastoral ministry and into full-time chalk artistry, and most specifically prison ministry. Well, prison ministry is very rewarding spiritually, but it doesn't pay anything. And I didn't get a very big check from the church I was pastoring, but at least it came every week. And I wasn't, again, ready to make that commitment, and I kept putting it off, and then finally God just kept working in my heart. And I told my wife Laurel, and said, that's my wife Laurel over there, she's graciously traveling with me and putting up with me for all these years. I told her, I said, we've got to step out. And the way God moved me to that is he reminded me of a passage in Scripture. He said, Jim, you remember when Israel came to the Promised Land and came to the Jordan River, it didn't part until the priests stepped into the water. I said, yeah, I know, but I really don't want to do that. But I told Laurel, I said, okay, we've got to step out. So I resigned my pastorate. We had 2 young children at the time. Had no idea what we were going to do for an income. But I had it figured out. See, for some years I'd been trying to break in as a writer. And I told God, well, if you'll give me a book contract, then I can write to support our ministry, and we'll live off the book royalties, and then I can go into prisons. It shows I knew absolutely nothing about publishing at the time. But God is gracious. You know what I did? I'd written a novel, I submitted it, it went out, and you know what I got? I got the most wonderful, glowing rejection letters. We love this writing. We love this book. It's awesome. Sorry, we can't use it. Now, the first couple of those that you get, kind of exciting. After about 30, you kind of wish somebody would say, hey, don't quit your day job. I already had. We were about to go down for 3 weeks of ministry at summer camp, and I got an idea off the wall. We'd already left our ministry, had no guaranteed income, but I got an idea for a book on how to write web pages written by a non-techie, me, for non-techies. And so on a whim, I wrote up about 13 query letters, which is what you send a publisher if you want to pitch an idea, and sent them off. Just before we left for camp, I told Laurel, I've got to get these in the mail quickly so I can get my rejection letters back. You get cynical after a while trying to break in as a writer. We got back from camp, and there was a package on our front porch. And it was from Osborne McGraw-Hill. And they said, you know what? We like this idea. We have a series we'd like to work it into. Would you consider writing to our specifications? I said, let me think about it. Yeah. And so probably within 2 months of the time we left in faith, God gave me a book contract and a $12,000 advance to write that book. It's still actually out there. You can get it in Kindle version now. It's very outdated, but hey, it's still out there. Well, again, I got to fast forward, but that novel that I'd written, it found a publisher, because once you do break in, it's a whole lot easier to get other things published, or at least back then it was. The novel was about a pastor, because they say write what you know, so I wrote about a pastor because that's what I had been. And it was a pastor who had lost his family in an automobile accident that he had caused. Remember, this is just a made-up story, it's just a novel. But he was struggling with the goodness of God. And then 2 kids are dumped into his lap. They're being chased by a crazy killer religious cult, and he's got to rescue them. And in the process, he comes to grips with why God kept him alive, even though he lost his family. Well, when I submitted that novel, my literary agent, you get to have a literary agent once you get the book out there, it makes you feel very important. Really doesn't mean that much. But my literary agent got it into 3 publishers. They were competing for it. And Tyndale House picked it up. They published it as under the title Blind Sight in 2003. And when that book came out, there was a lot of hype from Tyndale. There was a lot of excitement because I was an up-and-coming young fiction writer, and there were great things expected. And I expected really great things, particularly money. Because I figured this book is going to sell. In fact, it had only been out a few months, and when it was out a few months, I got my first royalty check, and it was $800. And I said, this is wonderful. Book's only been out a few months. If the first check is $800, what's it going to be 6 months from now? $10,000, $12,000, $15,000. I was going to be the next Frank Peretti, John Grisham, fill in any famous name you want. I had made it. And I said, God, this is wonderful. You worked it out. You're gonna totally underwrite everything I'm doing. And that was great for the next 6 months as I anticipated my second huge royalty check. Now, to tell you how full of myself I was at this point, and I'm not joking or exaggerating, I was thinking, we live out in the country. Famous writers have to have security. And there's tons of acreage behind us. So I said, we'll buy the property behind us and then put up a big fence, and then our son can live in our house in front of us, and he can be my security. And yeah. Well, 6 months later, my second royalty check, I'll correct that, my second royalty statement arrived. I was waiting with great anticipation as Laurel brought in the mail. I was sitting in my recliner. My hands trembled as I began to open the envelope to see how big my check was going to be. And I pull out the paper inside and open it up, and there's no check. I look in the envelope again, maybe it got stuck in there. There was no check. And then I opened up my statement and began to read, and there was a very sad, consoling letter from my agent apologizing. Because at that moment I learned one of what I call the dirty secrets of publishing, and that is, if your book, when you get a book contract, you get what's called an advance, and that's just kind of, it's an interest-free loan based on what they think the book will earn. And if it earns that out, and if it pays that back, then you get royalties. And if it doesn't pay it back, you don't get royalties. And I knew that part, but I'd already gotten an $800 royalty check, so I figured it had earned out. What I didn't know was if books aren't selling, the bookstores don't have to keep them. They send them back to the publisher. And if they send them back to the publisher, guess whose account gets charged? Not only did I not have a $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 check, I was in the hole $2,500. Now, that's not money I had to pay back, but it was money that the book would have to earn back before I'd ever see another penny. I was shattered, and I'm not exaggerating that either. I had built up such big hopes of being a super famous author. And it all came crumbling down. And I wept in my chair as I held that letter, because everything I'd figured out, I'd worked God's plan out for him, and my plan didn't work. And I pouted, and I don't know how long I pouted. It was weeks, maybe months, who knows. But eventually God kind of slapped me upside the head and said, you're really being kind of selfish. And I said, yeah, I am. And then I finally said, God, I wrote this novel for you. And I wrote it because I wanted to touch people's lives with your faithfulness, your goodness. And so, if you'll just take this book and touch one person's life, I'll be pleased. I'll be happy. Well, again, we have to fast forward. The book eventually went out of print, and it sold about 8,000 copies. That's not bad for a first-time author. But once it went out of print, I had a bunch of copies, so I just started giving them away. I figured I couldn't get people to buy them. I might as well give them to them. And I gave one to a friend of our daughter's, her mother. Her name was Penny Caffey. And I never heard anything else about it. But several years later, in fact, in just about 2 weeks, it will be the 10th anniversary of this event. Several weeks later, well, it was several years later, but the Caffeys, Terry and his wife Penny, had to make their daughter break up with a boyfriend. And several days later, that young man and another young man broke into the house. And I'm not going to go into the details, but they killed the family, except for Terry, set the house on fire. And Terry had been shot 5 times. He escaped through a bathroom window, crawled, this was March 1st, 2008, about 3 in the morning, very cold, about the same temperature as it is right now outside, crawled about 400 yards to a neighbor's house, blood loss, 5 bullet wounds. His main prayer was, Lord, let me get to the neighbors so I can identify who did this, because he'd heard one of his sons mention the young man's name, Charlie, that was the boyfriend. And he said, let me get over there and then let me die. Well, Terry got there. He didn't die. They got him to a hospital. And they told him, well, there's good news. Your daughter wasn't in the house. So even though he'd lost his wife and 2 sons and their house, at least he had somebody to get through this with. But then several hours later, they came back and they said, Terry, we have to tell you, your daughter has just been arrested. She was implicated in the crime. So not only had he lost his wife, his 2 sons, his house, everything, his own daughter was now charged with planning the very crime that took his family. Terry fell apart with good reason. Now, Terry was and is a Christian. He was about to be ordained to be an evangelist. And his life was shattered. He had to live at his sister's house, slept on the living room sofa. And at night, he was so afraid, he would sit up all night, barricade the door, and watch. He'd turn on the TV really loud so he couldn't hear any of the sounds, because it was kind of a creaky old house. In the mornings, he would then double dose on Xanax and Zoloft and pain meds to knock himself out, and secretly was hoping that he wouldn't wake up. He had gotten into the habit of going out to the burned out remains of his property and digging through and trying to find things that were left over from the fire. And he found some little toys and belt buckle and frying pan and stuff like that. And he went out there and he would take those and bring them home. Well, he went out one day, and by now the property had been cleared. There was nothing left there. He was standing on the blackened earth where his house used to be, and he was crying out to God, and he was saying, God, why did you let me live? Why didn't you let me die with my family? And then he looked, and about 15 feet away, leaning up against a tree, was a burned piece of paper. And that paper wasn't just any piece of paper. It was a page from my novel that had survived the fire. And it wasn't just any page from my novel, 400-page book. It wasn't just any page from my novel that had survived the fire. It was the page where my character came to grips with God's goodness in his loss. The first words that Terry saw, this is an actual scan of the burned page. You could look at it later. First words he saw were, I couldn't understand why you would take my family and leave me behind to struggle along without them. And I guess I still don't totally understand that part of it. But I do believe you're sovereign. You're in control. And I know that you brought Justine and those children into my life. And they need me, Lord. You could have taken my life that day, but you spared it. And you've gone on sparing it. It doesn't matter what happens to me now, but if I can help them, please let me do it. That moment, Terry fell on his knees, and God turned his life back around. Today, he travels and goes into schools and churches. He goes into public schools, shares his story, talks to teenagers about the consequences of their actions and their choices. I had prayed, God, if you'll just touch one life with my book, I'll be happy. You know, I heard about this, and it's a very long story about how I heard about it. But when I heard about that, I said, if I never write another word, I'm fulfilled as a writer. I can't top that. And to this day, I rejoice in knowing that God not only cared about Terry, but he also cared about letting me know, hey, just because you aren't necessarily seeing the results you expected, don't think for a moment that I'm not working, because I am. I don't know what you're facing today. I don't know where you are spiritually, but I know that God knows every detail of your life. I know that he cares deeply about every detail of our lives. And he is there, and he will meet you, and he will take your circumstances and use them for his glory. You may not in this life ever see the results. That's to me one of the greatest benefits of this whole thing, is God let me see what he did. We don't all get to see that. But I like to share it as an encouragement to others. God knows what you're facing, and he's going to use it. Paul wasn't kidding when he said, in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who are the called according to his purpose. And, if you want to know more of the details of the story, that's what's in that book back in the back. Again, I left a lot of the details out because we got a lot of young children here. But it's an amazing story. And it's one I'm honored to be able to share. But now I'm going to shut up and draw. The picture I'm going to draw is called Lord of the Troubled Sea, for obvious reasons. He is the Lord of our troubled seas. We face those as we go through life. You don't get through life without troubled seas sooner or later. The key is understanding that he is Lord of those troubled seas, and that no matter how bad things appear, he's still at the pilot wheel, and he's going to bring you where he wants you to be. As I draw, I draw to music. I don't talk while I draw, and I've learned, the reason is I've learned that I can either draw a good picture or I can say something intelligent. I can't do them both at the same time. So as I draw, you'll hear two songs play. And the one is the title of the drawing, Lord of the Troubled Sea. The second one is called Bound for Greater Things. I preached at a church a couple weeks ago and preached out of Luke 12. And it was talking about worry and being worried about tomorrow and what God, would God provide, would God take care of us. And right in the middle of that, Jesus says, don't worry, little children. Your Father is pleased, or has been pleased, to give you the kingdom. There's no reason to worry, because you, in Jesus Christ, if you know him, are bound for greater things.